The truck doors burst open with a metallic shriek that echoed across the compound. 3 German women prisoners stepped out into the bright September sunlight, squinting against the glare as their eyes adjusted from the cramped darkness of their transport. September 15th, 1945, Camp Blackwater, Indiana. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed by months of grinding fear and uncertainty. Ingrid, the oldest of the 3, leaned close to the others, her voice urgent and low. "Remember," she whispered, "tell them nothing, expect nothing. They will break us slowly, bit by bit, with questions that seem harmless and small kindnesses that cost them nothing." They had been told terrible things about the Americans, stories passed between camps in hushed voices, tales of savage brutality and torture without mercy. The women braced themselves as they looked around, preparing for the worst. Barbed wire everywhere, starvation rations, the violence they had learned to expect from every new captivity. But then something shifted in the air around them. A scent drifted across the compound on the September breeze, something clean and fresh. Real soap, genuine soap, not the harsh mixture they had grown accustomed to, but something that spoke of hot water and actual bathing. "Ladies, welcome," came a voice in English, followed by translation, "We'll get you processed and cleaned up." That voice belonged to Captain Mitchell. When they were shown to actual beds with white sheets, to a washroom with hot running water and folded towels waiting on each metal rack, one of them broke. Greta's legs gave way and she sank onto the edge of a bunk, her body shaking with sobs. "They're going to kill us," she whispered to the others. "Nobody is this kind unless they want something far worse." Ingrid placed a hand on the younger woman's shoulder, but said nothing. What could she say? The Americans had given them something no German prisoner expected to encounter again. Something almost forbidden. Hope. 3 weeks earlier, the truck had lurched forward on rough roads for what felt like an eternity. Through gaps in the wooden slats, Ingrid had caught her first glimpse of Camp Blackwater, stretching across the Indiana landscape beneath a pale September sky. Guard towers rose like skeletal fingers against the horizon. But something about the place felt wrong. The barbed wire seemed almost decorative rather than menacing. The building stood too clean, too orderly. Where were the smokestacks she had heard whispered about in frightened conversations back at the transit camp? Ingrid pressed herself against the truck's interior, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had once run a field hospital, someone who had seen enough war and cruelty to know what usually came next. "Remember what I told you," she said to Greta and Anna. "Tell them nothing. They will break us slowly." Greta, barely 22 years old, sat with corn silk hair matted to her skull. She clutched a small photograph against her chest, a family portrait she had managed to keep hidden through 4 different prison camps, smuggling it through searches and interrogations. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it deeper into the lining of her threadbare coat. "What if they search us again?" she whispered. "They will," Ingrid said simply. "They always do." Anna, the 3rd woman, said nothing at all. At 38, she had already survived Stalingrad and the long retreat through Poland. She had endured 2 Soviet camps before American forces took custody of their transport. Her eyes held the flat, empty look of someone who had stopped expecting anything beyond the next meal, the next day. She sat perfectly still as boots crunched on gravel outside, as male voices called out sharp instructions in that alien language. Then the truck doors swung open. Autumn sunlight flooded the cramped space. Ingrid squinted against the glare, her heart hammering as she braced for the familiar ritual, the shouting, the rough hands, the casual violence that marked every new captivity. Instead, she found herself looking up at a young American soldier whose face held something she hadn't seen directed at a German in 3 years. Simple courtesy. Professional respect. "Ladies," he said, his voice steady and calm. Another soldier stepped forward. A woman in officer's uniform, brown hair pinned neatly beneath her cap. Captain Mitchell, according to her insignia. She spoke to someone behind her, and moments later a man in civilian clothes approached with a gentle smile. "I am Klaus Weber," he said in German, his accent carrying traces of Bavaria. "I will translate for Captain Mitchell. She wants you to know that you are now under the protection of the United States Army and that you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Ingrid felt her jaw tighten. The Geneva Convention. Words. She had heard similar promises in different languages from different uniforms. They always started with rules and regulations, carefully worded commitments that crumbled the moment no one was watching. But then Captain Mitchell did something unexpected. She stepped forward and extended her hand to help Greta down from the truck. When Greta recoiled, pressing herself back into the truck's shadowed interior, the captain simply waited. Her hand remained extended. Her expression stayed patient. No impatience, no sharp command. Just waiting. "You will be processed first," Weber translated as Captain Mitchell continued. "You will receive medical examinations, clean clothing, and work assignments. You will have access to male privileges, medical care, and small wages. The captain wants you to understand that while you are prisoners of war, you will be treated with the dignity that international law requires." The words washed over Ingrid like something from a half-remembered dream. She had heard variations of this speech before. The Soviets had been more direct in their brutality, but these Americans seemed to take pleasure in the elaborate performance, in making their victims hope before disappointment could set in. She climbed down from the truck with whatever dignity her cramped muscles allowed, refusing the offered hand. Anna followed silently, her face blank. But Greta hesitated at the truck's edge, her eyes wide as she took in what lay before them. The camp was nothing like what they had expected. Clean pathways stretched between well-maintained buildings. Garden plots lined some of the structures, bright with late-season vegetables. In the distance, women prisoners walked freely between buildings, some carrying books, others engaged in conversation. And beneath it all came that scent again. Soap. Real soap. "It's a trick," whispered Anna. "It must be." But even she couldn't keep the uncertainty from her voice. 3 weeks into their stay, Ingrid stood in the camp infirmary, her hand steady as she cleaned a wound on a fellow prisoner's arm. The woman had stumbled during kitchen duty. The familiar rhythm of medical work felt like returning to a half-remembered dream. The careful assessment of injuries, the gentle pressure of bandages, the quiet satisfaction of healing rather than watching things fall apart. Dr. Patterson, the camp's chief medical officer, observed from across the room as Ingrid sutured the cut with practiced efficiency. She had been skeptical when Captain Mitchell first suggested that the former German field surgeon be allowed to assist in the medical facility. But 3 weeks of watching Ingrid work had dissolved most of her reservations. The woman's hands remembered skills that transcended nationality, and her gentle manner with frightened patients spoke of someone who understood suffering intimately. "Excellent work," Dr. Patterson said quietly in her limited German. Ingrid felt something inside her chest crack slightly, not breaking, but softening in a way that felt dangerous. She had been prepared for many things in this American camp, but not for professional respect, not for the gradual restoration of an identity she thought the war had stripped away forever. In the makeshift classroom, Greta bent over a piece of paper, her tongue caught between her teeth as she struggled with English letters. Tommy, a young guard who had volunteered to teach basic English during his off-duty hours, sat patiently beside her, pointing to pictures in a children's book he had brought from town. "Farm," he said slowly, tapping a drawing of a red barn. "Farm, like my family has, back in Ohio." "F-arm," Greta repeated, her accent thick but determined. She looked up at him with eyes that were beginning to lose some of their haunted quality. "Your farm big?" she asked hesitantly. Tommy grinned and pulled out his wallet. He extracted a creased photograph of a modest farmhouse surrounded by cornfields. His parents stood on the front porch, waving at the camera. Greta studied their faces with fascination. These were enemy faces she had been taught to fear. But in the photograph, they looked like any German farming couple, weathered by honest work and softened by family love. "Not so big," Tommy admitted, "but it's home. Someday when this war stuff is all finished, I'll go back and help my dad with the harvest." He paused, studying Greta's face carefully. "Do you have family?" "A farm." Greta's hand moved instinctively to the hidden photograph against her chest, but she stopped herself. Trust was still a luxury she couldn't afford, even with this kind young man who brought her chocolate bars from the PX and never seemed to grow impatient with her halting English. From her office window, Captain Mitchell watched the daily routines of camp life unfold with growing satisfaction. The integration was proceeding better than she had dared to hope. Work assignments had been distributed according to skills rather than punishment. Former teachers helped in the camp school. Women with sewing experience mended uniforms. Those with cooking skills found themselves welcomed in the mess kitchens, where their knowledge of making filling meals from limited ingredients proved invaluable. But her satisfaction was tempered by growing pressure from above. Colonel Harrison's visits had become more frequent, his questions more pointed. He wanted intelligence about rocket programs, about factory locations, about anything that might prove useful to the ongoing Pacific campaign. He couldn't understand why Captain Mitchell's soft approach wasn't yielding information that harsher methods might extract. These women are not strategic assets, she had argued during their last meeting. Teachers, nurses, farm wives, not rocket scientists or military planners. Every German knows something useful, Harrison had replied coldly. Your job is to find out what that is. The colonel's words echoed in her mind as she watched Anna working in the camp garden, her movements methodical as she harvested late tomatoes. Of all the German women, Anna remained the most closed off, the most suspicious of American intentions. She performed her assigned duties without complaint, but offered nothing beyond what was strictly required. Mitchell sensed that Anna held the key to understanding whether their approach was truly working or merely creating a facade of cooperation. In the dining hall that evening, something unprecedented happened. The sound began at one of the tables where German women sat with their evening meal. A soft chuckle, barely audible above the clatter of cutlery and conversation. Another woman added her voice, and soon an entire table was sharing what appeared to be a joke. Their faces were animated in a way that spoke of returning humanity. The American guards noticed immediately. Several paused in their duties, struck by the simple novelty of hearing German laughter in their camp. It wasn't the bitter edge of hysterical laughter that sometimes escaped from prisoners pushed too far. This was genuine, cleansing. The laughter of people beginning to remember that joy was possible even in captivity. Ingrid sat apart from the group, watching this small miracle with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to join them, to surrender to the dangerous comfort of believing that perhaps these Americans truly meant what they said about dignity and Geneva Convention protections. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive by expecting the worst, whispered warnings about the price of hope deferred. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, carried in the regular mail delivery that had become one of the camp's most anticipated daily rituals. Ingrid's hands trembled as she recognized her eldest son's careful handwriting on the envelope. Heinrich. He would be 15 now, assuming he had survived the final chaotic months of the war. She had not dared to hope for word from her children. She had convinced herself that they were likely dead or scattered beyond finding. Klaus Weber, the translator, sat quietly beside her in the small room designated for mail reading. His presence was a gentle reminder that even this most private of moments was subject to scrutiny. But his face held no judgment as Ingrid's tears began to fall. When she looked up at him with desperate gratitude, he simply nodded and looked away to give her what privacy he could. Heinrich wrote that he and his younger brother were safe, living with their grandmother in a village outside Munich. The final bombing raids had missed them. American forces had arrived with food and medical supplies, rather than the vengeance everyone had expected. We have enough to eat, he wrote in the careful script she had taught him years ago. The Americans ask about you sometimes. They say prisoners are being treated well. I hope this is true, Mama. We pray for you every night. Across the camp, Greta experienced her own small triumph. Tommy had brought her another book, a simple reader about American customs. For the first time, she had read an entire paragraph aloud without stumbling over the unfamiliar words. Her pronunciation was still heavily accented, but the meaning came through clearly. Tommy's proud grin made something flutter in her chest, something she had not felt since before the war began. Tommy's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity as he studied Greta across the table during their afternoon lesson. You're getting really good at this, he said. Then his expression grew more serious, as if he'd suddenly gathered the courage to ask something that had been weighing on him. Greta, can I ask you something? What was it like in Germany before everything went crazy? She looked up with surprise. Throughout all their weeks together, he had maintained careful boundaries, sticking strictly to the mechanics of language without ever venturing into personal territory. But something in his face now suggested this wasn't the probing questions of someone conducting an interrogation. This was the honest, searching look of a person trying to make sense of a world that had become hostile to him. She took a breath, searching for the right English words to capture something so vast, so lost. "It was beautiful," she began. "My family had a small bakery. Every morning the smell of bread would fill everything, and people were happy then." She closed her eyes, remembering the weight of those mornings before the world had fractured, before everything changed. Tommy nodded slowly, his farm boy face growing thoughtful. "My dad always said regular folks are mostly the same everywhere. It's just the leaders who make the trouble." These small moments of connection might have continued to deepen, but darker forces were already stirring in the background, gathering momentum towards something neither of them could stop. Colonel Harrison arrived that morning with a considerably larger group than usual. Military intelligence officers accompanied him, their eyes sharp and calculating as they swept across the camp, with the clinical assessment of men accustomed to seeing everything and trusting nothing. First and Mitchell met them at the gate, her spine perfectly straight, her expression carefully arranged into something neutral and professional. But Ingrid noticed the subtle tension that had crept into her shoulders. The way her movements had become slightly more rigid as she guided the visitors toward the administration building. The change rippled outward immediately. Guards who had grown comfortable in their routines suddenly snapped to attention with exaggerated precision. The informal conversations that had developed between American personnel and German prisoners became stiff and formal, drained of the easy familiarity that had begun to define the camp's daily rhythm. Even Tommy seemed unsettled during that afternoon's English lesson, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the windows as if he feared being watched, judged for his attention to a German woman's education. Anna was in the camp library, carefully cataloguing a stack of water-damaged books, when she heard raised voices carrying from the direction of Captain Mitchell's office. The distance and solid walls muffled the exact words, but the tone was unmistakably confrontational, sharp with accusation and frustration. She set down her pen and tilted her head, listening more intently. Fragments of conversation drifted through the heavy air, talk of results and wasted opportunities and softer approaches that yield nothing but complacency. That evening, the atmosphere in the dining hall felt transformed. Conversations dropped to whispers. Several women kept glancing toward the administration building, where lights remained burning well into the darkness. The guards themselves seemed tense, their usual casual friendliness replaced by a watchful formality that served as a sharp reminder that this was, fundamentally, still a prison camp. Ingrid sat with her letter from Heinrich, reading it for what must have been the fourth time, when she noticed the way silence was spreading through the hall like ripples expanding across still water. Following the direction of the other women's gazes, she looked up to see Colonel Harrison entering with his escort of intelligence officers. His eyes swept across the room with calculating coldness, and when they landed on groups of German women sitting together, his expression hardened with visible disapproval. Captain Mitchell followed behind him, her face a careful mask of composure, though her hands had clenched into fists at her sides. She caught Ingrid's eye for just a moment, and in that brief glance, Ingrid read something that made her blood run cold. An apology offered in advance, a warning of what was about to unfold. The colonel's voice cut across the dining hall with brutal clarity, making no attempt to keep his words private. "This all looks very cozy, Captain, very comfortable. But comfort isn't why these women are here. Tomorrow we begin a different approach, one that might actually produce some useful intelligence." As the officers filed out, leaving behind a room filled with frightened faces and uncertain whispers, Ingrid carefully folded Heinrich's letter and held it against her chest. Whatever was coming, she would need every source of strength available to her. The security breach was discovered at dawn on Thursday morning, when Sergeant Williams reported that classified documents detailing troop movements across the Pacific Theater had gone missing from the administration building's filing system. Within hours, the camp transformed from a place of tentative hope into something sickeningly familiar to every German woman who had learned to recognize the warning signs of catastrophe arriving. The lockdown order came swiftly and without mercy. Male prisoners lost their privileges immediately. Work assignments outside the barracks were cancelled. English lessons, garden duties, and all the small freedoms that had begun to feel like stepping stones back toward humanity simply ceased. Guards who had learned to call the women by their names became faceless figures behind rifles, and the easy conversations that had built themselves carefully over weeks of patient trust evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Ingrid found herself confined to quarters with 15 other women, the clean sheets and comfortable beds suddenly feeling like theatre props in some cruel production designed to mock them. Through the barracks window, she watched Captain Mitchell pacing the compound alongside Colonel Harrison, her shoulders rigid with what appeared to be barely contained fury. Even from a distance, it was obvious that whatever conversation was happening between them was not proceeding in Captain Mitchell's favor. "I told you so," Greta whispered from her bunk, her voice hollow and defeated rather than triumphant. Like someone watching a prediction she had dreaded come true. It was all a lie. The kindness, the respect, the promises about the Geneva Convention, all of it was just another form of torture dressed up as mercy. The individual interrogations began that afternoon. One by one, women were called out, escorted by armed guards toward the administration building where intelligence officers sat waiting with clipboards and questions stripped of any warmth. Those who returned looked shattered, their eyes holding that familiar glaze of people methodically dismantled and found insufficient. Anna was among the first. She sat across from a major whose nameplate identified him as Kellerman, a man whose pale eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. He pressed her about factories, weapons production, any technical knowledge she might possess. When she explained for the third time that she had worked as a librarian in a small Bavarian town, that her expertise encompassed cataloging systems and children's books, but nothing remotely connected to military secrets, his expression grew progressively colder. "Everyone knows something useful," he said, repeating Colonel Harrison's words like a threat. "The question is whether you're smart enough to share that information willingly or whether we'll need to explore other methods of encouragement." Ingrid's interrogation came 2 days later. She found herself in the same chair, facing the same cold questions about rocket programs and weapons development, explaining with mounting desperation that her medical training bore no connection to military technology whatsoever. The officer interrogating her was younger than Kellerman, but considerably more ruthless, and he seemed particularly focused on her work in the camp infirmary. He suggested that her access to medical supplies and personnel files made her an invaluable intelligence asset. "Captain Patterson trusts you," he said, leaning back with calculated casualness. "She discusses cases with you, she shares information about camp operations. Surely someone in your position has overheard useful conversations, observed interesting patterns." The implication hung in the air like poison. They wanted her to betray the woman who had treated her as a professional colleague, who had restored some fragment of her dignity. They wanted her to prove that every stereotype about German treachery was justified, repaying kindness with betrayal. Captain Mitchell, meanwhile, was fighting her own desperate battle in her office. Colonel Harrison had been unmistakably clear. Either she produced actionable intelligence from her prisoners within a week, or she would face court-martial for dereliction of duty. The camp would be transferred to more aggressive leadership, and her entire experimental approach to prisoner treatment would be terminated permanently. "These women are not strategic assets," she argued again, but her protests rang increasingly hollow now, undermined by the missing documents that had precipitated this crisis. "They're civilians who got caught up in something far bigger than themselves. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford," Harrison replied with indifference. "The war in the Pacific continues, costing American lives. If these prisoners possess any information that could save even one of our soldiers, then extracting that information becomes a moral imperative." The transformation of daily routines was swift and thorough. Hot meals that had come to symbolize American abundance were replaced with cold rations. Medical supplies that had allowed Ingrid to practice her profession were locked away under armed guard. Books and writing materials that had sustained the women's intellectual lives disappeared overnight. Most devastating of all was the systematic reintroduction of institutional cruelty into ordinary interactions. Guards who had learned to say please and thank you reverted to barked orders and contemptuous silence. Clean towels vanished, replaced by rough fabric that scraped skin made tender from weeks of proper care. The scent of soap faded from the barracks, replaced by the familiar smell of disinfectant and despair. Greta sat on her bunk that evening, staring at the blank wall where a small mirror had hung until the security sweep claimed it. She pulled her hidden family photograph from its concealment and studied the frozen faces of parents and siblings she might never see again. For a brief, shining moment, she had allowed herself to believe that dignity might survive captivity, that enemies might choose mercy over revenge. Now that hope felt like the cruelest joke imaginable. The truth surfaced on a rain-soaked Monday morning when Private Johnson found the missing classified documents wedged behind a filing cabinet in the records room, apparently having slipped from an overstuffed folder 3 weeks earlier during routine filing. No German prisoner had been involved. No security breach had actually occurred. The entire crisis that had transformed the camp back into a place of fear and suspicion had been constructed on nothing more substantial than a filing error and one young soldier's reluctance to admit he'd misfiled important papers. Captain Mitchell stood in Colonel Harrison's temporary office, holding the recovered documents while rain drummed against the windows like an indictment. The intelligence officers who had spent days interrogating frightened women about non-existent secrets packed their briefcases with expressions of professional disappointment. Their methods had produced nothing because there had been nothing to produce, yet the damage to the camp's carefully constructed atmosphere of trust felt potentially permanent. "Well," Harrison said with casual indifference, his career unaffected by the week's revelations, "at least we know the security protocols work when they need to." Better safe than sorry. He paused at the doorway, his cold eyes surveying the rain-soaked compound one final time. "Keep them on restricted privileges for another week," he ordered. "Just to maintain discipline. Can't have them thinking this was all some kind of mistake." But it had been a mistake, catastrophic and trust-destroying, revealing how fragile their experiment in dignified treatment truly was. Captain Mitchell watched the colonel's convoy disappear into the October darkness and absorbed the weight of 27 frightened women whose faith in American promises had been shattered by paranoia and institutional fear. In the barracks, silence had become the primary language. Women who had begun sharing stories of home and hope now sat on their bunks staring at walls, their faces carrying that flat expression of people who had learned not to invest emotion in anything that could be seized and taken away. Greta clutched her hidden family photograph, but no longer dared look at it, afraid that even this small comfort might somehow be discovered and confiscated. The silence fractured only when Anna's voice cut through the oppressive quiet with shattering clarity. "They cleared us," she said to no one in particular. "The missing papers were found. We did nothing wrong." She looked around at faces that had stopped believing in vindication. "But we're still here, still locked up, still being punished for crimes we didn't commit. This is what American justice looks like when nobody is watching." Ingrid sat on the edge of her bunk, reading Heinrich's letter for what felt like the 100th time. The paper soft from constant handling. His words about Americans bringing food and medical supplies instead of vengeance now seemed to mock her circumstances. Perhaps he was witnessing a different type of American than those running prison camps. Perhaps kindness was reserved for conquered civilians, while cruelty remained the standard for captured enemies. Perhaps she had been foolish to imagine that mercy could survive the machinery of war, but that afternoon brought something unexpected. Captain Mitchell appeared in the barracks doorway, not with the official bearing she had maintained throughout the crisis, but with the hesitant approach of someone drawing near to a wounded animal. In her hands, she held something small and familiar, Greta's confiscated family photograph, the one taken during the security sweep. She walked directly to Greta's bunk and held out the photograph without ceremony. "I'm sorry," she said simply, her words carefully pronounced in German, words she must have practiced with Klaus Weber. "We let fear win." Greta stared at the offered photograph for a long moment, afraid to reach for it, afraid that movement might cause it to vanish. When her hands finally trembled forward to take it, tears blurred her vision. "You were afraid too," Ingrid said quietly, studying Captain Mitchell's face with new understanding. It wasn't an accusation, but recognition, one survivor acknowledging another's struggle against forces beyond individual control. Mitchell nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Fear makes cowards of all of us," she replied through Claus's translation. "But that doesn't excuse what happened here. It doesn't excuse what we took from you." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Tomorrow, normal privileges will be restored. Male prisoners, work assignments, medical access, everything. I can't undo this week, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again." She looked around the barracks at faces beginning to show cautious hope. "Not on my watch. Not to you." As Captain Mitchell left, promising hot baths and clean towels by evening, Greta held her family photograph up to the grey afternoon light streaming through the windows. The frozen faces of her parents and siblings looked back at her, their expressions belonging to happier times, before war had taught everyone that kindness was a luxury and trust a dangerous vulnerability. But perhaps, she thought, as steam began rising from the restored bathhouse across the compound, courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to offer mercy despite it. Perhaps dignity wasn't something that could be handed out or stripped away, but something that existed in the space between people who decided to see each other as human beings worthy of respect. The photograph trembled in her hands, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like holding hope rather than mourning it.